When I was a kid, I was in a plane crash by myself, no less. Had to go down the slide and everything. We were fine. Belly flopped on a runway. We were totally fine. In hindsight, I was like, wow, that was a deeply scary event. But as a kid, it was an adventure. I didn't know it. Well, my French teacher was on the plane. It was a 747. And I'm the only person I know who's ever had to actually go down the slide. And I was fine. Everything was fine. It was an adventure. I've always loved 747. 747s are to me. I've never even cared for like the A380, that double decker behemoth from Airbus. The 747 is like my favorite airplane. After it is the 777. 777 is a fantastic plane as well. I love the 777, and Boeing used to do great jobs. Airbus is now starting to innovate more. At some point, I'll tell you, like if I ever could afford a private jet, I don't really want a Gulfstream. Falcon, Dassault makes a great one. Bombardier makes one, but the Cessna makes this mid-range jet called the Longitude. And it's just, the great thing about Cessna is that anybody who can fix planes can fix a Cessna. It's not super proprietary, so the maintenance costs are reasonable and stuff like that. It's a very reliable plane. A lot of corporations have this plane. There are lots of great innovators out there. Bombardier makes great planes. Embraer from Brazil makes good planes. The problem for Boeing is that over time, Boeing existed more and more on government subsidy. And by existing on government subsidy, Boeing stopped innovating. And over time, Boeing started relying more and more on bean counters to keep the company in check than Boeing relied on engineers to innovate. And it's had cascading effects on Boeing over time. I want to play for you some audio this morning. Phil Mattingly at CNN interviewed a Boeing whistleblower. And it's remarkable listening to the whistleblower talk about the things going on at Boeing that have been well documented for some time now. It's kind of, it's not good at all. Boeing asking for special exemptions from the government. They've cut back on quality inspections, post-build quality inspections. This whistleblower claims that Boeing has cut back on doing stuff like that. It's absolutely absurd.
Very, very concerning. Yeah.
Were the specific issues, when you talk about the issues that you have seen and concerns that you have raised, were the issues that appear to have happened in this case issues that you had raised, seen, or been aware of before this happened?
Yes. This, when you talk about loose bolts on an airplane, that's obviously not a good thing. We had many, many problems with when we put a plane through the assembly line. There's a lot of people that are working on that plane, and those employees are rushed if they're fatigued, if they don't have proper quality control. Those kinds of things can occur. And as you've seen, it's, when it happens on one plane, there's a very good chance it's happening on other planes. So we have seen issues in electronic and electrical issues involving the airplanes in service. And, we've had improper electrical bonding and grounding in the factory. We've seen issues with gaps and shimming issues. These are very important quality type measures that we have to take advantage of. And what's happening is there's this just urge to get these airplanes out the door. So employees are, all the variables that were in place, I guess what I'm saying, all the variables that were in place in 2018, 2019, before those crashes are still there.
No, that's Ed Pearson. He was a Boeing employee and whistleblower. He now leads an outside safety watchdog group. And one of the things that Ed told Phil Mattingly on CNN is that Boeing has stopped doing just basic safety checks on planes like quality control inspections. And they've requested special exemptions from engineering standards over time. Now, I want to take a slightly different angle on this from a lot of the commentary out there because there's a real frustration that I have now. When anything happens in the world today, the left rushes out and says it's racism. It's racism. Whatever happened, it's racism. I'm afraid that a lot of people on the right are beginning to do the same thing and just say, well, it's DEI. DEI is to blame. And I saw this in the discussion about Boeing. They found loose bolts on Alaska Air and United Airjet. They're the largest users of the 737-9 MAX in America. And a bunch of conservatives rushed out and said, well, it's DEI. DEI is to blame. It frustrates me because so many smart people just want to be dumb, guttural, tribal, and like on the left, they scream racism. On the right, they scream DEI. Y'all, I've interviewed whistleblowers from Boeing. I've interviewed engineers at Boeing. None of them have ever, in the 10 years that these issues have started being flagged, have ever raised DEI as the problem. There are problems. It's not DEI. And it just dumbs down the conversation. And people on the right are supposed to be smarter than this, than to just say DEI. Let me explain to you the problem at Boeing. Boeing is a company that stopped innovating. They tried, and it kind of blew up in their face with their composites when they did the 777. They took some risks with it. It's a brilliant airline. I would, if I could fly a 777 anywhere, I would. The planes are so big they don't go everywhere. But it is the safest plane made, the Boeing 777. The assembly line for the 777 is good. It's great. The 787 had all sorts of problems at first. It's the one where they use composites, and they've got lithium-ion batteries that have had problems. They started having problems. And that plane, I think, got Boeing scared to take risks. When you talk to the engineers at Boeing, again, they don't say it's a DEI problem. They say it's an accounting problem, that Boeing put the accountants in charge. And they put the sales team in charge. And they have metrics they have to meet. And so they rush the engineers to get the planes out of the door. They're more and more complicated. They rely on a bigger supply chain. They rely on more diverse composite parts that are made in different locations. And they have to get them to Washington to put the planes together. It's a more complex build. And they rush and rush and rush and rush and rush. And they've ignored the engineers who have said they're building the planes at too fast, at too large a scale. And it's causing problems that we're seeing play out, and it has nothing to do with DEI. It has everything to do with Boeing decided to slow down its invention and its discovery and its science, go with a lot of repackaged products, adding inches to planes instead of coming up with new planes. The 737 is the longest existing plane in production. It is the world's safest. I say the 77, but in terms of track record, there are so many 737s. And if they don't have the word MAX in them, they're good. Like, for example, Delta Airlines. I fly a lot of Delta Airlines. Delta has notably shifted a lot to Airbus planes. But Delta flies 737-800s and 737-900s. Those are not the MAX versions. And they're reliable and they're good planes. And they're based on the old engineering standards. They're not filled with all the new composites on the new assembly timeline scales with the accountants nickel and diming everything. They're great planes. The MAX was supposed to show Boeing could innovate, and they failed to innovate. And they failed to innovate because Boeing at this point is sclerotic and exists with government subsidy. Boeing stopped trying to outcompete the Gulfstreams and the Bombardiers. Now, Gulfstream does a different thing. It does private airlines and government manufacturing. Bombardier used to make civilian aircraft, and now they mostly do private jets and military things like that. But they're still out innovating. So Bombardier has a new plane out, the Global 8000. It's a private jet. It can hold 19 people. It can go almost around the world. It's hyper efficient and goes supersonic. Now, the FAA won't allow them to go supersonic, but in the flight test, this plane with engines on the rear of the plane, not under the wing, went supersonic. Boeing doesn't have anything like that. Look at Boeing's rocket program. Boeing's rocket program is over budget and behind Elon Musk, and the government wants to use Boeing to get us back to the moon, and Boeing just exists with government subsidy. The company needs a shakeup, and it needs to be engineering-led. You know, I'm a fan of Apple. One of the things that Steve Jobs instilled in Apple's culture is that Apple was going to be engineer and inventor driven. It wasn't going to be sales team, and it wasn't going to be marketing, and it wasn't going to be accountant driven. It was going to be engineering driven. They were going to deliver these fantastic products that worked in this closed ecosystem so well people would never want to leave it. They would push the engineers to do innovative things, But if the engineers couldn't do it, they weren't going to force it and they weren't going to slow them down and rein them in. Boeing used to be that way. About 10 years ago, Boeing stopped being that way. And it's not a coincidence that when Boeing started being more focused on its price-earnings ratio than on its innovation, it started having these sorts of problems. Cutting corners, nickel and diming, rushing the engineers, setting things up to be able to do them regardless of the science and the engineering quality. I do not want to fly on a 737 MAX. I don't think you should either. Thankfully, I fly mostly on Delta, and they don't have any in their fleet. United and Alaska have the bulk of them. They've all been grounded, and they're all finding these loose bolts. And engineers are coming forward saying, we said this was going to happen. There needs to be a major shakeup at Boeing. And you notice, like, we've had these recurring problems now with MAX. This is not the first problem. They had those crashes overseas. Why is the CEO still there? Does no one in America like fall on the sword anymore and say, my fault, I resign? Like Lloyd Austin, Secretary of Defense. Lloyd Austin's not out there saying, you know what? I shouldn't have done this. I'm sorry, I resign. That doesn't happen anymore. Everyone passes the buck of blame as opposed to owning it. The CEO of the company should own this stuff. The culture that CEO has fostered at Boeing for some time now is not a good culture. It has nothing to do with DEI, though. Stop blaming everything you hate on DEI, because oftentimes then you don't get to the root of the problem. The root of the problem here at Boeing is not that Boeing is infested with DEI, and I don't deny it's got DEI problems. It's also got problems with still relying on Zoom instead of people coming back to the office. A friend of mine yesterday, Martha, texted me and said Boeing engineers she's talked to said they're still doing Zoom calls instead of meeting face-to-face, and that's a problem. But it's not always about DEI on our side any more than it is racism on the other side. Sometimes there are real issues, and screaming DEI just allows you to ignore the real issues. And the real issue, in Boeing's case, is they are a company that decided to rest on their laurels, give up the innovation, put the engineerings aside, and put the accountants in charge. And now the chickens are coming home to roost from that decision.